Okay, good. Anyway, I'm glad you guys are here, and I really appreciate your organization seemingly opening up and allowing people to travel, and also especially MD Expo, their staff, and all of our vendors here that are helping making these programs possible. So I think aside from the educational stuff, yeah, I think it's just so incredibly important just for our professional, emotional well-being to get together with like-minded geeks and souls and just hang out and share our stuff and kind of get recharged in some respects. So what I'd like to basically share with you is a number of things that we've learned over the last 20 years or so when it comes to medical device injuries, patient injuries and deaths. Many of you, unfortunately, may have experienced some of these along the way. I had about 22 years in healthcare doing hospital, HTM biomed work, and then for a good 20 or plus years after that, I did a number of expert witness cases involving medical devices, and really quite tragically, virtually every single one of them was a fatality, and often very gutting, very crushing, and there's often a tremendous amount of material and information we can learn from these unfortunate incidents. The problem is virtually every case that I was in, I had to sign non-disclosure agreements to never, ever, ever talk about it. And 5-10 years ago, I just said, this is just, I can't do that anymore. And clearly, we're going to share some case studies with you. And obviously, we're not going to get into specifics about the details, the people, the institutions involved, but the lessons that we can extract and should extract from these cases we're going to share. So just basically topic-wise, where we're headed, with just some basic purpose of why ethically, morally, legally, scientifically, we need to investigate these incidents, and also some of the competing and complementary forces that are involved when it comes to trying to figure out why something went wrong, and then a handful of us, just some basic actual case studies to see how these concepts have been applied. Our whole patient safety movement really got started with this pivotal report from the IOM Institute of Medicine in '99, where they first came out claiming that we were killing approximately 99,000 people per year in our nation's hospitals due to medical error. That number has since been elevated and has got much more specific to where we're over 400,000 accidental deaths in our nation's hospitals every year. It makes it literally the third leading cause of death, medical error in the country. But early on, what came out of that report, one of the main concepts that came out of that report was that these errors are caused by our systems of healthcare. Processes and conditions that kind of encourage people to make mistakes. If they made an error, they weren't able to back out of it. And that was a main takeaway from that initial report. So we learned a lot from that initial study, which got this whole movement kind of moving up. And since then, in the last 20 years, there's just been a ton of additional research, books, there's actual specific journals on patient safety out there. We've got just a flood of information that we're picking up on and we're learning from the tragedies that are going on in our hospitals, which is a good thing. Okay? But we're still having issues. This is even this paper from 2013. This is probably even pre-cybersecurity issues, but it's the intrinsic complexity of our medical devices. Virtually everything is firmware, software driven based. It's just ripe for a lot of cybersecurity and crime. And 10-15 years ago, this kind of stuff wasn't even almost on the radar screen. So we're learning a lot about the failures and the vulnerabilities of our systems right now. Just the sheer fact that we can get hacked is revealing vulnerabilities within our systems. So fortunately, there's also a tremendous amount of really good resources on how to do these incident investigations. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but the VA has a great handbook out there that they just came out with some number of years ago. A great resource if you haven't come across that. And of course, ECRI, the Emergency Care Research Institute, is probably one of the pioneers in doing incident investigations early on. So there's a lot of good material out there on how, from almost a cookbook perspective on how to go about doing these investigations. And collectively, what they all kind of tend to focus in on and agree that optimally, within any given organization, the best approach, kind of optimally, where we get almost the best return, is if we can do it in a team kind of a perspective, where you have representatives clearly from our community, HTM, biomed, nursing, the clinical side. If any of a patient safety group, they're represented, and even our facilities people should be on a group like this as well, because we'll see there can often be a ton of related structural things within an organization that can contribute, if not, maybe not directly cause incidents, but they can contribute to them. And some of the general, again, preferences is that group you kind of manage through your risk management group within the hospital, as they often have the authority and the charge for overall risk assessment. And again, every organization is obviously different, but conceptually, that's a model that you see often talked about in these different publications. The real advantage of having a group, a team approach like that is, and it may be obvious, is that different disciplines, quite literally, depending on how we're trained, our experience, our background, can literally look at the same thing and see different things. So, you know, from our HTM perspectives, we're just by definition laser beam focused, geeky, techie guys and people. So things happen, we tend to focus naturally on the technology, the devices. Clinicians are going to be looking at workflow, different issues. They're going to look at patient-centered kinds of things. So we get different groups look at things differently. So just like looking at the pointer here, depending on the angle that you look at it, you see something different. So a group team effort is often a very, very good thing to have if you can handle it. The downside and the realities are these different backgrounds can sometimes be like, you know, two north poles of a magnet. You just are not going to cooperate and talk to each other. There can create communications issues. You can have turf battles issues. I don't know how many times in my old days, if I just implied that a nurse was an idiot, screwed something up, well, you're going to have some hell to pay for that. You know, you're challenging and attacking, you know, my people. And then conversely, if the clinical people challenged us and said we didn't know what we were doing technically, you got stuff like that going on. But again, theoretically, conceptually, and this does work in some places, the team approach is good. So fundamentally, why do we do these things? Why should we do these things? It's kind of a no-brainer. The reason is to ideally determine the root cause. What happened? You know, why did this patient lose a limb? Why did they die? What went wrong? And the goal, obviously, again, is to prevent a reoccurrence. If we've investigated, if we've learned something from it, and then we can apply that knowledge, we can minimize it from happening again. This is exactly what the NTSB is all about and does when it comes to investigating airplane crashes. And they have a mandate by Congress to do just that. That's why you will see them on site within often hours of a major plane crash. A team, they've got you know, everything from medical professionals looking at body parts and how they died, engineers focusing on the engines, the avionics. They even have forensic psychologists doing psychological autopsies on the staff, trying to figure out where they may have been mentally. But they're on the ground, picking through everything to find out what went wrong. And this is precisely why aviation is such an incredibly safe mode of travel, because we've learned from decades and decades of horrific accidents. We have nothing comparable to that in healthcare. I don't know if you've heard of John Nance. He's been an aviation correspondent on ABC News quite a bit. Sometimes you'll see him on the news. He's been a very, very profound, strong safety advocate within healthcare, encouraging healthcare to kind of think about and borrow so many of the things that they've learned in aviation, disasters and tragedies, that have some real transfer, some real applicability and value in healthcare. A lot to be learned from that. Even the VA. Got any VA guys here? Anyway, the VA in 1999, right when the IOM report came out, they established a National Center for Patient Safety, which kind of models itself after NTSB. They've got a centralized clearinghouse in the U.S., districts throughout the hospital, the country. Within each VA center, there's regional safety people that report up to this group. I don't know when it was now, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a cross-contamination outbreak within a VA hospital where they were cross-contaminating people from either endoscopic surgery or colonoscopies or something, and they didn't know what caused it. They didn't know what was going on. They did exactly what the FAA would do. They just grounded and they stopped doing all endoscopic procedures throughout all the VAs until they could figure out what was going on. And within our private sector hospitals, they probably wouldn't get away with that. The GI guys would be up in flames and yelling and bitching, and you can't do that. VA said, we're going to cut it all down until we figure out what happens. They isolated the specific hospital the system that had some sterilization issues, fixed the problem, and they went on. And it was a little bit later than that, I wrote a little editorial. I thought, how incredibly cool would that be for healthcare to have a group that has the authority of an NTSB, that had the ability to go in and do these kinds of things, some of the skills and resources of an ECRI, and then the kind of a mission comparable to the VA, pie in the sky academic, head thinking kind of thing. I thought it would be kind of cool, but we were still a long way from that. But in those institutions and organizations that are trying to do these things and are getting better and better at it, what we see is a decrease in injuries and deaths, care interruptions, user anxiety. And we'll see some of this in lawsuits. For some of the clinicians that are involved, not some, but almost all of the clinicians I work with that are involved in these tragedies, it is the most gut-wrenching, almost career-altering experience for them. If they come to find out that they accidentally killed a patient, can you imagine how incredibly crushing that is, can be for a caregiver whose goal is to fix and help people? I mean, they're just a mess. Many of them just bail out of healthcare. They're working at McDonald's. When they used to had a skill of caring for patients. On the other hand, what we see, increased patient outcome, satisfaction, usability. The clinicians come to trust the technology more than they don't have as much fear. User satisfaction, even reimbursement, because Medicare, I don't know what the current numbers are, but there's a number of conditions that they're no longer reimbursing hospitals for. Falls, infections, kinds of things, because if there are preventable errors, you're not going to get reimbursed as an institution for trying to correct those. So from these different perspectives, the common goal is, patient safety. Everybody can kind of get their head around that, kind of obviously. But depending on your viewpoint of the definition of what patient safety is and what it requires, has different pieces to it. And many of them complement each other. They work together. But some, like on the legal side, can be competing. In virtually probably every defense case that I worked on, whether it be a hospital or a manufacturer, I think my marching orders were almost always don't write anything down, because it was potentially discoverable and could potentially be used against their client. So here, from a scientific and all these other perspectives, we're trying to find out what went wrong. But on the defense side, other side, legally, if what went wrong is going to hurt my client, I don't want to know about it. And I don't want you to tell me anybody about it. So like, shut up, call me, don't write anything down, kind of thing. So sometimes we can be at odds in our goal of what we're trying to do here. Ethically, all professions have canons of ethics, and within engineering, which we're all really a part of, whether we maybe have a formal degree or not, one of our fundamental goals, ethically, morally, is protection of public health. We are not going to actively go out, obviously, and do something that's unsafe or going to put patients at risk. And furthermore, if we have some understanding and a knowledge, which society tends to hold us to a higher standard of, because we've got education supposedly, we have another obligation to act on that added knowledge to do the right thing. In fact, I took that canon in my first crazy days right out of school. It's like a bull in a china shop. One of my very first jobs was here in Milwaukee at a local hospital, just kind of part-time. And I didn't really understand a lot of what I was doing technically about leakage currents and safety. I cut the plug off of a treadmill because it had like a couple microamps of leakage over some limit. I was on this mission from God to save everybody from dying. So I cut the plug off on a cord around using the treadmill. Well, you can imagine what happened. I got ripped the new one for, because I had patients lined up to do stress tests. They ran the plugs off the treadmill. But anyway, we all have perspective on this. Clinicians obviously have Hippocratic oath, do no harm, so they have the same kinds of mandates. Even Florence Nightingale, some 160 years ago, thought it was kind of wild that she had insight of saying that the hospitals should do no harm. So she'd probably be spinning over right now if she knew what was kind of going on. But on the regulatory side, again, federal law, FDA is mandated that as a facility, user facility, if you just think that a device may have contributed to an injury or a death, you don't have to even have proof yet. But just have it, if it's reasonably likely that a device injured or killed somebody, you have to report this. This is a federal mandate that we have to, as institutions, report these suspected injuries or deaths, and you only have 10 days or so to do it. That's part of the law, the mandate, and more often than not, we'll see this doesn't get reported for a number of reasons. But that's the general requirement, is if you just suspect something is going on. And often within 10 days, very rarely can you make an evaluation and assessment to know definitively that something has happened. And the critical thing, and I often, this is another thing we've learned over the years, is when we fill out these incident reports, and this is also why having a risk manager in charge of the committee, risk management, is a central clearinghouse so helpful, because they often may have lawyers in their department, in your own facilities, they can be very good at helping us formally and correctly filling out those incident reports. Because everything that you put in a document like that, you can almost bet that if there is a trial lawsuit, that is going to be discoverable information and the jury is going to hear about it. So what we generally want to do is we want to obviously do the right thing, but keep the information to the facts only. Even if you know exactly who or what caused the incident, try to keep that stuff out of it, because invariably it can come right around and really bite you. And so much so that this report from 2012 from Inspector General's office, they looked at it, they did a study on hospital reporting systems to the FDA, and what they concluded is that about 86% of the events that should have been reported were reported. People scared the hell out of them. That's one of the conclusions they came to. Partly they didn't know quite what was reportable, and the other one is just the fear of retribution, getting fired, lawsuits, reprimanded, and so stuff just didn't get reported. Even the FDA will admit to they don't know a fraction of what's really going on out there, because people don't report it. What they do report, they report it properly. And from an engineering, scientific perspective, if it's not reported, if we don't know about it, we don't investigate it, we're not going to learn anything. Can you imagine just where aviation would be right now if 86% of the plane crashes never got investigated? We never found out that you can't put lithium-ion batteries in the cargo holds. All these things with the 737. If you never ever investigate it, you're never going to know. And that's the lost opportunity. And unfortunately, within healthcare, we're still pretty much below the surface here when it comes to really knowing what's going on. So on the engineering scientific side, that's one of the reasons I don't do the expert witness stuff anymore. I still do some consulting if it comes up, but I can't do I can't play with the lawyers anymore. We're just so at odds fundamentally, professionally, at why we do these things that I can't work with it anymore. I probably turned out as many cases, if not more, than I took, because oftentimes an attorney would get the first part of the conversation. Well, I'm going to need you to be able to say this. No. We don't even know what's going on yet. I can't agree to say something that I don't know what's going on, and that's when they'll tell you to go away and get somebody else. Okay? But anyway, from that perspective, in engineering and all of science, this is the only time we learn anything. Literally, when things fail, when they blow up, the Challenger blows up, shuttle explodes. Damn, how did that happen? The poor building in Florida. How the Christ does that happen? The whole building just collapses. And we're going to find that out. But the only time we really do is when we have these catastrophic accidents. So we always learn more from the failures. Henry Petrosky, he's written a number of books. He's a civil engineering professor, I think still at Duke. And he's written a number of really good books on precisely this, evaluating failures and learning from failures. Why did the bridge fall down? Well, you keep looking, you'll find a bolt that floated or was undersized or used improperly. And so that's how we learn, but only if we investigate the failure. And how we kind of go about doing this, it takes a different kind of a mindset that we kind of have to sometimes rearrange your viewpoint of the event in the world. And it has to do with inductive reasoning skills that we have to bring to these investigations. In forensic engineering, it's essentially detective work, just like you see on the CSI and CIS TV shows. It's exactly the same kind of approach where you have some event, somebody dead on the street, they died. That's the observation, the event, and now we have to figure out how did that happen. And so it's kind of a backwards kind of an approach where you observe the event, the incident, and you formulate some kind of theory or idea on what might have happened, but you don't know yet. And that's what the hypothesis portion is. You then, if we're lucky, you try to gather as much evidence, as much facts as you can. You put all that together, come up with a conclusion, theoretically. Okay? What often can mess things up, and I like this quote from somewhere, that often, because it screwed me up many times in my early days, at this hypothesis state, I would often come with a conclusion. I have to make an assumption. And I'm frankly ashamed to admit it, but many of our older guys here, 20, 30 years ago, everything was the nurse's fault. They didn't plug it in, they didn't turn it on, they did this, and it's blame. Bad news. But once you have a preconceived idea of what went on, it really messes up the rest of the process. Okay, so it's really good to try to not do that in the beginning. It's also incredibly helpful, this is not to be deceptive in any way, but you may have some specific ideas quite clearly and maybe very accurately as to what happened, just from your sheer experience, your knowledge. It's kind of good initially to keep that to yourself. Tentatively kind of hold in the back of your head, but you don't want to go broadcasting it to your committee or to others that you think you know what may have happened. It can again really mess things up. We're gathering the evidence. This is classically everything. You sequester the device, do everything you can to also secure any disposables, even blood-soaked, urine-soaked, contaminated things, everything. Get the wrappers. There may be useful lot numbers, expiration dates on catheter wrappers, things like that. All of that can be useful evidence going forward. Interviews, testing, all of that is part of that fact gathering stage. And we then apply the analysis, which as technical people in general, this is kind of what we're fundamentally trained and born to do, is to problem solve and to think, put the pieces together, and come up with some fundamental conclusion. And if we're lucky, we'll find out the absolute root cause. And if we're really lucky, and if we had to, you see this done on some of the TV shows, where they'll actually try to do a replication, to recreate the incident, reconstruct the incident, blood spatter kinds of things, to show and to demonstrate the likely angle of a bullet, club, or whatever. And if you can replicate, then you're even more solid in your conclusions if you're able to do that. This is kind of just the opposite, the mental state. This is just the opposite of what we do inductively. Classic engineering research, and research in general is primarily steeped in this kind of thinking, where we'll do a ton of experiments, take measurements, and we'll look for relationships between variables, come up with some kind of hypothesis and test a theory. It's kind of how general science works all the time. If we're trying to find a cure for COVID, a new drug to lower blood pressure, we do experiments like this. We look for relationships. We do testable hypotheses statistically. And if we're good at it, we'll be able to come up with a theory as to what we can do to treat or minimize condition. And if we get really lucky, you'll get a Nobel Prize, because you just come up with a new law, Ohm's law, Newton's law, where you have an incredibly stable, repeatable relationship now. I equals V over R. It's not up for debate. It works every stinking time. You've got a law. So that kind of thinking is a little bit different. And why we need to use both of these, it's just the stuff that we work in all the time. Our hospitals have become just incredibly complex systems, not just systems, but high-tech, high-risk systems. And they're often systems, not often, they are systems within systems. which adds a whole other dimension to the complexity. This is even some of this stuff is even pre-network stuff. So imagine the additional complexity. We got a baby here, a patient. You see these. This is our environment we're in, and it's just a very complicated environment with virtually no standardization. Right? Every NICU you go to, every ICU, you'll see something different. Other places. So one of the other things that, again, we've learned from these incidents, and they worked for me immensely, is to, before I started on anything, I tried to get a sterile slate in my head. And regardless, even when I was doing a legal case, when I was looking for plan of defense, I just would tell them it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what side I'm on. They don't want to hear. The attorneys don't want to hear that. In my mind, I don't care what side I'm on. Okay? So the sterile viewpoint, and then also what was essential is backing up the camera and getting what I call this systems perspective of our environment. And that's kind of hard for us, I think, as technical people, because we're trained to focus on the machines. That's what our thing is. But by backing up the bus a little bit, by the system, it's the patient, the clinician working with these machines in an environment that can be very complex. Lighting, facility design, is your X-ray department, imaging department like half a block away from your ED? So you're taking head trauma patients down elevators, down hallways, over thresholds, banging them up even further. Lighting, gases, the noise level issue and alarm fatigue, still a very, very, very big issue, all part of the environment. It influences how all of this works. And the key here is where the patient, the clinician, machine all come together at this thing we call interface. And this is where it gets complicated, because there's really no other place other than healthcare where we do this, where we make direct, deliberate electrical connections to patients' bodies, not accidental, deliberate, good low impedance connections. Catheters, fluid-filled catheters and arteries, veins, skulls, measuring pressures. The pulse ox are pretty non-invasive, so that's, don't worry too much about those. Pneumatic connections to ventilators. Pretty much every orifice we've got, we're going to stick something in there, just because we can. If we run out of holes, we're just going to cut a new one in there and stick more things in it. But this adds a tremendous amount of complexity, because now the patients, not figuratively, but really quite literally one with the machine. One with the machine. And that adds a whole other dimension. From the clinician's perspective, if you think about this, the machine is talking to the clinician, trying to, with its icons, lights, labels, script chart, waveforms. The machine is trying to talk to the clinician. The clinician over here is trying to interpret that. Patient's in the middle of all of this. And when you think about it, and if it works well, it's a pretty intimate dance kind of thing going on. All of this stuff is in a big loop, kind of trying to work together. But often it's at the interface where the frustration comes from. You old guys, we've seen this. Doesn't matter that that's $10,000 box on the table. You've seen clinicians go nuts and destroy stuff. Surgeons, how many times have you seen surgeons just rifle something across the room? Pass it up a blue street. And I've become pretty convinced that why we get so emotional, not just the incredible dependence they have on this stuff, obviously, but I'm also convinced more so that the machine is almost mocking them when it doesn't work right. You're a dummy, you don't know nothing. The hell, this thing goes flying. And there was a thing in Milwaukee, this was 10, 15 years ago, one of the suburbs. If you vaguely remember it, some guy couldn't start his lawn boy. He couldn't get the lawnmower started. He got so mad he went in the house, he got a shotgun, came out, he just blew the shit out of his lawnmower just because he couldn't get it started. It's that same kind of nuts that people get because the machine is dummy. And but then the opposite also works, right? When these machines are friendly, truly user friendly, the machine comes up to, they come up to it, it works, they get good detent from their finger, and it's like, oh, you're a smart person. You're like, the user feels good with a friendly machine. So this is also an issue. Another procedural approach that we've learned, and I've used all the time because it worked for me really well, it was this model that came developed by James Reason. He's a behavioral or experimental psychologist from the UK. Right around 2000, he came out with the Swiss cheese model of accident causation, he called it. Well, I tweaked it around a little bit, but the concepts, for me anyway, were really, really helpful because in our environment, what the model shows is that in any high risk environment like we are, there's all these threats, intrinsic threats, just blasting away at the patients the whole time. Medication errors, mistakes, all kinds of threats, just intrinsic to what we do. The way we prevent those threats from doing harm is we set up barriers between the hazard and the patient to hopefully protect them from these intrinsic threats. Ideally, in engineering, what we want to do is design out the hazard in the first place, so we would eliminate the threat. You know, the dead man switches in the lawnmowers and snowmobiles. Design out the opportunity to cut your hand off in order to protect them. So we have administrative policies. This is what we do with job requirements. Not allowing you to work 48 hours in a shift, that kind of stuff. The facility designed properly. Our equipment obviously is a big role in that. And often the last line of the defense are our clinician users. What the Swiss cheese model implies is that these barriers, despite our best efforts, are not perfect. They have holes, weaknesses in them, that if we get these weaknesses all in alignment, then that's when things happen. So that procedural framework, when I would go into these cases, I kind of have these models in my head. I'm going to look and think about all of these potential barriers that are there and how well they work or didn't work. And Reason goes on to point out that these holes can lead to active failures, or he calls them also latent conditions. And the active failures are what we just typically associate with a screw. Yeah, they didn't plug it in, they did something wrong, causes the problem. The problem if we just follow that approach is that we tend to stop the investigation. Once we think we solved the problem or we found out the root cause, we just tend to back up and we stop. We don't look at the rest of the system. On the other hand, latent conditions, he calls them, which I really like that term, resident pathogens. These are things that are embedded in the system, in the product, in the design somewhere that are waiting to blow up, but we don't even know they're there. And it takes a blow up before we find out why it happens. A bolt, a rusty bolt, improperly fastened girders or something, but it's these latent conditions in here that can create these problems. So getting our head around trying to be aware of these can go a long way in preventing heading off the catastrophe. And then lastly, on the legal side, this is what I meant about the competing nature of this. And this continues to have a profound impact on our ability and inability to investigate. I'm convinced it's the nature of our society is we're so afraid of getting sued that we often back off because of that. But this is the classic scenario. Patient gets injured, they're a plaintiff, they're going to sue whoever they can. Oftentimes they'll bring the manufacturer, the physician, the hospital. Depending on what state you're in, and there may be limitations and caps as to who they can sue or not. So that's the typical scenario that's going on there. And again, what you have documented and what you don't have documented can again come back to bite you. I did a case, and we teach our students to keep very detailed logbook. In fact, logbooks, John may remember that, design logbooks, paper notebooks, and I was testing out. It was a device for treating microwave skin tightening kinds of things. It was a handpiece design I was looking at, and I got to a point in my investigation that I wasn't sure of something. So I had a big question mark on the page. I'm going to recheck this a little later. Well, this was right in the beginning when I was doing this. First thing I had, all that stuff was discoverable. So the other side got my notebook with my question marks in there. During a deposition, he pulls it up on the screen. What's this, Dr. Fennigkoh? You know what you're talking about here, do you? He'll try to make me look like an idiot. So I hate to kind of tell you this, but after that, I kept running over. I'm going to give you that notebook, I'm going to give you another one, and I'm going to keep it myself. But it's because these things can come back to bite you on how we document findings. Not that you have to kind of water it down, or we just have to be be much more mindful as to what we write down and conclude. Because some of these critical concepts, discovery, both sides in the suit have access to whatever you have. The knowledgeable attorneys in an equipment-related lawsuit, they're going to, one of the first things they would come and ask you for, if they know of it, is to see your inventory, your work order history on the device in question. A lot of them don't know that that stuff exists. Because if they did, they'd be in there digging through your CMMS system. Interrogatories, they can ask questions. Either side can ask questions later on during a suit like that. And then also a big one, especially when it comes to investigating our devices, is spoliation of the evidence. Sometimes we can do this without even knowing it, but we can destroy evidence without even maybe knowing that we're doing it. And this is specifically easy to do with many of our devices that have error logs or event logs built in, and you can pull out the last things that were done on the device. Every time you turn it on or when the alarm, turn it off. If that information is not extracted, downloaded carefully, you might blow it all away. I did a taser case a number of years ago, the guy that was killed here in Wisconsin, and I found out afterwards the taser has such a log in the tasers. I got a download kit from someplace, North Carolina maybe, and I was able to download the entire event log from the taser. And so I did all kinds of testing on the device. The battery starter, the original battery starter run down, so I found the same site. I ordered another battery for the taser. Little, I didn't know it, but the taser battery, my cartridge, had firmware in it. As soon as I plugged it into the taser says, I don't recognize this battery. Shut the whole thing down on me. Unfortunately, I was finished with the case, and it never went anywhere, but that would have been spoliation of evidence. I was testing it, didn't fully know what I was doing, put the wrong battery in, and now that event log is gone. That's not a good thing to do. So anytime you have any idea, pumps, ventilators, or whatever it might be, that has that event log in it, if you're not really sure, get an Exemplar, go get another machine, exact model, and do all your testing on the Exemplar. Don't do experimenting. Well, I think this is how I do it. I'll punch these buttons and I think I know what I'm doing. No, do it on an Exemplar, something exact replica. Don't do it on the actual device if you're not 100% sure. Okay. So just a handful of case studies here to show you kind of how all of this stuff went into play. And again, all of them had some just really tragic outcomes, unfortunately. So we got a ventilator death, fire defibrillator, IV free flow, and some laparoscopic related injuries. And this first one on a defibrillator death, I got retained by an attorney who was potentially going to represent a family who had an infant who had some multiple congenital birth defects. They brought the baby home on a ventilator at home, and the parents claimed that the machine just stopped. We didn't hear it going to alarm or anything, and baby died, and we're going to sue the manufacturer. So the attorney wanted me to go through the ventilator. Is there anything wrong with this ventilator? I could corroborate their claim. So my hypothesis at this point, I thought, well, maybe were the alarm limits set? You know, being in a home environment, maybe the alarm volumes are too low, they couldn't hear. Was the outlet port, the alarm obstructed? So these were just some of my initial thoughts before I knew anything. What might have gone on? So I did the performance testing, downloaded the event log, which took months to do. I had an Exemplar in which to use it. So I followed the manufacturer's guidelines and tweaked them and modified them a little bit. But trying to get that download event log out of the machine, I couldn't go to Complementary at the time and say, hey, you might be sued. Are you going to help? Can you help me figure out how to do this? And I couldn't go to them and ask them how to do it. But fortunately, there was a guy, we used to have a Biomedical blog website kind of thing years ago. There was a really good guy out there that had the procedures. It wasn't even in their manual. The procedures on how to do it wasn't even in the service manual. But he had a memo on how to do it from Complementary. And he also had a special cable. It wasn't an RJ11 or RJ45. It was a funky RJ type of connector. There was a real messy process to download that data. But ultimately, was able to do it, parse it all out, clean it up. And what did he actually listed here? It showed that at 12:23, the external power was lost. So he unplugged the ventilator, pulled the plug on the ventilator. But of course, these ventilators, battery operated, kept running. A couple of minutes later, oh, they turned it off. a minute later. The downside here, the thing was, is that they didn't call 911 until a couple hours later. So it strongly suggested somebody in the family deliberately shut that ventilator. So as soon as the attorney saw that potential homicide, that ran away. They just ran away. Oddly enough, a couple years later, a virtual identical kind of a case happened. Very similar ventilator. Now I knew how to get the log out really clean and nice. And what this showed is that at 1:13, the machine was turned off. It was turned back on at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And the attorneys go, yeah, so? I said, who was breathing for the kid? You're not going to bag, an ambu bag a baby for 5 or 4 hours. And then he thought, whoa, because he already suspected something fishy had gone on. Well, the baby didn't die. They turned the ventilator off. Kid didn't die, not until a little later in the evening. Another potential homicide that he ran away from because he didn't want to touch it. But that kind of evidence would have just been crucial if it had. This is a case at one of the hospitals I was at. Middle of the night, cardiac patient, post-cardiac surgery, was in the CVICU, went into cardiac arrest in the middle of the night. Nurse went to defibrillate him, and a ball of flame, not a spark, ball of flame engulfed head, neck, chest. First, second degree burns all over his chest and neck. You can see the intensity of the flame went through the stopcocks, catheters. He had a swan line in, so he had a big 4x4 gauze on his neck. And of course, needless to say, it hits the proverbial fan when this kind of stuff happens. We just don't blow out people in the ICU. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, the ICU is freaking out, they're bitching me out, and they automatically, it was an instant blame because we were responsible for the defibrillators. Some of the very first assaults I got was, what's wrong with you people? We never had this happen before. Something's wrong with you because that defibrillator shouldn't have done that. Instant conclusion on their part. I'm trying to get them to back up the bus, find out what went wrong. The only thing I knew is, to start a fire, you got to have fuel, oxygen, the ignition source, but it was an upside down jigsaw puzzle. And every time, this took a couple months to reconstruct, because every time I went down there, they're not talking. They're not talking to me. I'm just covering my ass to get out of here. They just didn't want to talk about it. And that was very puzzling at the time. But in retrospect, it's now quite obvious that in order to do their jobs, they couldn't keep reliving this kind of stuff. It's almost literally like a post-traumatic stress response that I can't talk to you people about this because it's so horrific. Anyway, little by little, we were able to piece things together. Of course, we sequestered the machine. Nothing at all wrong with it. Absolutely nothing. I mean, it's a controlled lightning generator. I mean, that's what it does, right? And so, but we couldn't find anything wrong. I kept picking away, getting information, from the nurse that was involved eventually, and everything I could. And ultimately, what we're able to put together is that this patient was a big barrel-chested guy, and we're in the cardiac arrest. This nurse was relatively short stature, nothing wrong with that, but they typically will lower the bed, to facilitate chest compressions. Well, the bed didn't go down. They didn't lower the bed very far, and the patient was had a bed, trach tube in, 100% FiO2 with 100% oxygen, and the nurse, being relatively small stature, big patient, bed relatively high, she wasn't able to make good paddle contact with the patient. And here's where the arc occurred. And we even had a picture of the paddle that showed charring on the paddle and supported that. But again, these older Lao-based defibs, the old HP defibs, open circuit voltage of these things about 7,000 volts. There's some serious juice there, right, for that. And so with a poor contact, that's what caused the arc, the endotrach tube, the vent, they disconnected the ventilator. This is a anyway, we reconstructed this for the insurance because it's instant lawsuits. They don't even go to court on this kind of stuff. But they were dying, they're very eager to know how did this happen. So we created this little scenario to show they disconnected the vent tube, blowing 100% O2 around this environment here to spark the oxygen concentrated environment, and that's what put it all together. But it took a whole bunch of time, a couple months at least, not more, to do that. This is another crushing case where toddler, he's going a couple of years old, I think. He went in for a congenital heart repair defect. They brought him up to the pediatric ICU with multiple IVs running. Multiple IVs, which is not uncommon. One of the IVs is epinephrine, very powerful drug, obviously hormone, epinephrine. And later, that IV of epinephrine went into free flow. Nurse checked on the kid a little while. They swapped out the epi line on the pump, put a packed red cells IV at the same time. She waited a few minutes, came back about half an hour later. The IV, the bag of epi, was gone into the kid. Kid's in cardiac arrest. He didn't die, permanently brain damaged. And so I got retained by the manufacturer of the pump to help them out. And the hospital was claiming that this pump had the history of this door roller breaking off. That's what caused the IV to run away. A little door roller here that holds this little door shut. And my fundamental question is, would this pump even operate with a broken door roller? Because if this roller is sheared off here, there's nothing to hold this door engaging the cassette. So it would just flop down like that. Would the pump even work? So the company offered to give me a couple pumps. I said, nope, I don't want nothing. I don't want nothing from you people that I'm going to have to defend later on. I believe I gave you an enhanced, better version of the pump. I went on eBay. I got a couple of these pumps, same exact model number and everything from eBay. I gutted them, took them all apart, and did my own evaluation of the flow pathways, the different inlets, the valves, the sensors involved. How did this thing actually work, and why did it work the way it worked? And so this is just some colored fluid. I had water in the cassette to show the relative location. So that cassette has to have very, very firm contact with the pump body. There's these little solenoid valve plungers and valves that control the flow through the cassette. Okay. One of the other things I looked at, these cassettes also have a little valve. It's like a little faucet valve that allowed the nurses to do a fast flush if they needed to. So it's just like a little faucet. You know, with the pump cassette not into the pump, you can just turn the little knob and control the flow. So I characterized how that behaved and found out, just less than 1/8 of an inch, you could go from completely obstructed to almost a free flow condition. 800 mLs per hour, that's really moving. Okay. And that pump cassette, once it's in the machine, I don't know if this will work, the pump takes over control of the valve. See that? There's a little pawl comes out now, opens the valve. Okay. Now the machine has control over the flow at that point. And when you pull the cassette out, if you notice that, the valve got pushed back in. That's how it's designed, that's how it worked. The other thing I did, well, how could we shear the rollers off? Because they kept complaining, well, these pumps suck. That plastic roller's cheap piece of crap is always breaking. That was their defense and their arguments. I said, well, okay, how do you break a roller? And I thought, well, if you don't have the cassette properly engaged and you go and jam on it, yeah, you can break it. The pinch. I mean, it took, I don't know, 30-some pounds of force, 30 pounds of force. It's a level of force that any reasonable clinician would go, oh, something must not be right. You know, there's way too much resistance here. So yeah, it could be done. You could break it. And the other question I had, well, could you even operate this thing in with a broken door roller? I just found this out on a fluke. I had no preconceived a priori sense that I could do this. But I'm just holding the pump door closed. I turned it on, and yeah, and it goes through its self-test about 10 seconds. You can feel the pump, the pistons going in there. You're getting feedback. I held the door closed, and sure enough, I could make the thing run. The broken door roller. But, and only if, and you had to apply 3 to 7 pounds of force at that location where my thumb was. If I had too little force, I get a cassette alarm. If I had too much force, I get another alarm. So it was just this incredibly small little window that you could make it work. And how likely would it be for a surgery OR nurse and a PD ICU nurse to have known that and done the same thing? So essentially, the testing that I confirmed was that there was nothing wrong with the pump. If it had a broken door roller, it wasn't going to work. in the process of removing the FE line, the flow regulator somehow got moved. I tried to purposely say that nurse didn't do something right. The bottom line is the line wasn't clamped. This is kind of classic critical care nursing 101. When you disconnect an IV, you also clamp the distal line. For that very reason, the line wasn't clamped. And but in the poor nurse's defense, you've got multiple IVs trying to keep track of all of this stuff. She was a basket case, understandably, after this. And I don't know, it was like a year plus or more later, she was deposed and had to relive all of this stuff, and she just unraveled all over again. I thought, yeah, well, it often wrecks. We've got a nurse at MSOE, skilled ICU nurse. She quit, came to teach because she got pulled into a lawsuit on a drug-related overdose that she had absolutely nothing to do with. But just going through the process so destroyed her self-confidence. She said, I can't do it. I can't work in that environment. That's the obscene tragedy by all of this. Okay. So one of the last ones involves a middle-aged guy died about 7 days after having laparoscopic colon gallbladder removed. He went home, he had some pain, called his doc, said, yeah, it's kind of post-surgical stuff. You're all right. He had to go into the ED, went to the ED, they sent him back home. A couple days later, he died. Massive peritonitis, stomach contents leaking all out. I had the same procedure done last February, not this last one, the year before, lap chole at Freighter. And I went in there thinking, oh, crap, here it goes, I'm going to die. All this old stuff is just going through my head. But anyway, the only thing, again, my hypothesis at the time was there some mistake the doc made. I admit it, but that was one of my assumptions that the doc screwed up somehow. Was there some stray coupling or something from the electrosurgical currents used in the laparoscopic procedures? Because they burned the hole on autopsy. They burned the hole right through the stomach. And this was completely outside of the surgeon's view. When you're doing a laparoscopic procedure, it's like operating down into a long tube. So they can only see a very small area that they're operating on. And anyway, through the OR records and the literature review, and I found quite a few papers out there that supported this, which was quite surprising how common insulation failure in these instruments really is. I was quite stunned by it, actually. And that's exactly what ultimately happened. The insulation on these devices, especially through repeated cold sterilization, all eyes or stuff like that, can break down the insulation. And the high open circuit voltages that can be present during these procedures broke the insulation down. And so he was getting arcing into the stomach instead of where he was operating. What was really even more tragic, they had a device by incision. I don't know if any of you guys have these in your OR. They're kind of analogous to ground fault circuit interrupters with electrosurgical units. They'll interrupt the machine if they detected a fault, straight current like that. They had that machine, very machine, on the cart with the ESU, but they didn't use it for some reason. Because the OR record showed that that machine was on the cart. Had they used it for what it was intended for, it would have been all right. So the bottom line is that sterilization that caused the issue, and what's being recommended, but I can't imagine too many sterile services departments doing this. But there are testers out there to check the insulation on these laparoscopic instruments, because this stuff you can't tell. A visual inspection, you can't tell if that insulation is intact or not. Okay, so I guess the bottom line, I guess, to all of this is to treat every event, accidental death, as a precious learning opportunity. I can't tell you how often it was just crushing to me, and I felt it was literally a double obscene insult that you have to have somebody die and you don't learn anything from it. It's horrifying that they died in the first place, but to not learn why it happened is even more obscene. Okay? And seek to identify those active failures and the latent conditions in the big picture system that contributed to it. Not just the last error, because that's a common thing we tend to do, because once we do that, we then tend to stop. We think we've solved it. We don't tend to go on. You do anything you can to cut the blame out. This is one of the big takeaways also from John Nance's work with the aviation industry. They completely changed the way in which they train pilots and the cockpit crew to let them put out suggestions and keep them blaming away. But there's something in our culture, our society, there's something about blame. It somehow in a weird way makes us feel good that we've figured out what happened and we can put a blame on somebody. But it's incredibly detrimental to learning what happened. And again, the big takeaway, the only mistake is when we just simply, we don't learn again. So that's the whole gist of all of this, I guess, as unfortunate as these things are, is to do everything we can to kind of find out. I gave a similar presentation a number of years ago to a state, Wisconsin State Society of Professional Engineers. And there just happened to be a retired judge in the audience. And I even had more cases than I had here. And I went up to him and I asked him, I said, am I in any serious trouble for all the non-disclosure stuff that I signed that I'm not? He said, no, the way that I've been presenting, he says, you're fine. Just don't, get into specifics, names, places, dates, that kind of stuff. But everything I've signed is very specific on, you don't talk about it. Well, I told him, I don't care anymore. What are you going to do to me? But we got to talk about it. That's precisely why I talk about it, just to kind of help encourage us to do this stuff, because we're still the best ones to. Our training by nature is systems in a way. So we're some of the best trained in the hospital environment to do this kind of stuff. All right, make some sense? Kind of? Okay. Well, again, thanks for being here. Any questions? We can take a couple before we head up and we're out and get the road dirt down. Yeah, sure.